For everyone in her neighborhood in Culiacan, Sinaloa, Guadalupe Morales was simply Doña Lupita. At 70 years old, her life was a map of unchanging routines, traced between her small house and the noisy kitchen of the elementary school where she was the cook. Her hands, marked by time, were instruments of creation, famous for a seasoning that seemed to carry affection itself. She was the community's grandmother, a figure of stability, in a world that trembled under the invisible power of the cartel. The story you are about to hear is so unbelievable and powerful that it needs to be shared. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers so that accounts like Lupita's can continue to be told. Let us know in the comments what city or country you're watching from, as we want to know how far her courage can inspire. Lupita's life had been marked by loss. A widow for over a decade, she found in her only grandson, Javier, the reason to keep going. He was the light that filled the silent rooms of her home, the sound of his laughter, the soundtrack to her days. It was for him that she perfected her recipes, for him that she saved the first slice of every cake. The kitchen was not just her workplace, it was the sanctuary where her love materialized in the form of food. Every child she served at the school was in a way an extension of her grandson, and she fed them with the same zeal and care, finding in their innocence a refuge from the harshness of life in Sinaloa. However, that light was brutally extinguished. Javier, at 17, a young man with dreamy eyes and hands that refused to pick up a weapon, was murdered. His refusal to become a lookout for the local faction, Los Espectros, was seen as an act of defiance that demanded an exemplary punishment. For Lupita, her grandson's death was not just a loss, it was the collapse of her universe. The future she had imagined, filled with graduations, weddings, and perhaps even great-grandchildren, crumbled in an instant, leaving behind only a deafening silence and a void that no prayer or consolation could fill. The pain was a physical presence, a constant weight on her chest. The injustice that followed was a second blow, perhaps even crueler. The police, with an efficiency that bordered on indifference, closed the case in less than a week. The official verdict, stamped on a cold and impersonal report, was gang fight. This lie stained Javier's memory, labeling him as something he never was. Lupita felt the bitterness of impotence. The system that should protect the innocent not only failed, but became an accomplice by erasing the truth. To the authorities, Javier was just another number in the grim statistics of Culiacan. To Lupita, he was the entire world, and the world now lay in a grave covered by a coward's lie. The days following the tragedy were a blur of anesthetized pain. Lupita moved like an automaton, her body performing life's tasks, while her soul remained paralyzed at the moment she received the news. Cooking, the act that once defined her existence and expressed her love, became a mechanical torture. The aromas that once brought comfort were now triggers for painful memories. The school kitchen, once a haven of life and joy, transformed into a stage for her daily performance of normality, a facade she maintained with the last remnant of her strength, while inside everything was in ruins, cold and flavorless. The community, with the best of intentions, tried to reach her. Father Mateo visited with words of faith, speaking of God's will and the peace of acceptance, but his words sounded hollow, unable to penetrate the armor of her pain. Her neighbor, the young Mother Elena, brought her plates of food in an ironic role reversal, trying to nourish the one who had always nourished everyone else. Lupita would thank her with a nod, a faint smile that never reached her eyes. She was surrounded by compassion, but felt terribly alone, isolated in a grief that no one seemed to fully comprehend. A grief mixed with a silent rage that was slowly beginning to simmer beneath the surface. Inside the silence of her home, away from pitying eyes, that rage began to take shape. The paralyzing sadness gave way to a cold, focused fury. Lupita spent her nights sleepless, no longer crying, but remembering. She replayed every promise she made to Javier, every dream they shared. The image of her grandson, smiling and full of life, was superimposed on the coldness of the police report. A powerlessness that consumed her began to transform into a dark purpose. She, a 70-year-old woman, seen by all as fragile and harmless, felt a strength she never knew she had awakened within her, a frigid determination that demanded not solace, but a reckoning. Her routine became a perfect facade. The walk to school, the daily visit to the cemetery, the shopping at the local market. Every step was measured, every interaction a performance. No one could suspect the storm brewing behind her gentle, tired eyes. She became a silent observer, absorbing the details of the neighborhood she had always known, but now with a new perspective. She was a shadow, a presence so familiar it had become invisible. And it was in this invisibility, in the underestimation of her frail, motherly figure, that she would find her greatest weapon, preparing the ground for the journey of retribution she was about to begin, a journey that would change her forever. It happened on a Saturday, in the beating heart of the municipal market. The air vibrated with the chaos of life, the smell of fresh cilantro mixed with roasting meat, the shouts of vendors hawking their goods, the vibrant colors of fruits and peppers stacked in perfect pyramids. For Lupita, that place, once a source of pleasure and inspiration for her recipes, was now just an obstacle to be overcome. She moved through the crowd with her gaze lowered, a ghost at a feast of sensations, her shopping cart trailing behind her like an anchor. Her only goal was to get what she needed and return to the silent refuge of her home, away from the memories of walking these same aisles with Javier by her side, laughing and tasting everything. It was near the butcher's stall, while she was choosing onions, that the sound of laughter struck her. It was a loud laugh, full of a cruel, youthful arrogance. She recognized the voices even before she saw the faces. They were two young men, known in the neighborhood as soldiers for El Sombra, the leader of the Los Espectros faction. They were leaning against a pillar, counting money and boasting of their exploits. Lupita tried to move away, shrinking to become even more invisible, but then a word froze the blood in her veins, rooting her feet to the spot. The word was a name, Javier. Hidden behind a stall of mangoes, she forced herself to listen, her heart pounding uncontrollably against her ribs. What she heard next was the purest distillation of evil. They didn't speak of a fight or a confrontation. They spoke of a hunt. They laughed as they described the fear in Javier's eyes, mocked how he had begged for his life, how he had called out for her, his grandmother, in his final moments. Every detail was narrated with a sadistic pleasure, as if they were retelling the plot of an action movie. For them, her grandson's death was not a tragedy. It was entertainment, a story to tell and laugh about with friends. In that instant, Lupita understood the depth of the abyss that separated her from her grandson's murderers. They had no souls, no humanity. They were just monsters dressed as men. The pain inside her, an open and throbbing wound, was suddenly cauterized. The heat of tears gave way to a polar cold that spread through her entire being. The sadness that had been drowning her transformed into a sharp, cutting clarity as keen as a butcher's knife. Her grief didn't end, but it was transmuted into the raw material for a new and terrible purpose. The image of the gentle, heartbroken grandmother dissolved, and in her place something primal and determined rose. She looked at the two young men, no longer with fear or pain, but with the analytical gaze of a predator studying its prey. The question was no longer why, but how. Justice would not be a gift from heaven or the state. It would be a harvest, and she would be the reaper. Lupita turned away without a sound, her face an impassive mask hiding the furnace lit within her soul. She finished her shopping with a frightening calm, every gesture deliberate and precise. When she got home, she didn't light candles to the saints or weep over Javier's photos. Instead, she went straight to the kitchen. She opened her old recipe books, their yellowed pages stained with grease and time. But she wasn't looking for dishes that brought comfort. She was looking for combinations, for properties, for weaknesses. That was the moment of her irrevocable decision, a silent oath that echoed within the walls of her house. Official justice is dead, and I will no longer mourn for it. From this day forward, I will be the judge and jury myself. They took everything from me, and now I will use what I have left to hunt them down, one by one. Doña Lupita's kitchen, once a sanctuary of aromas celebrating life, transformed into a laboratory of silent death. The shelves, which once held jars of cinnamon and vanilla, now contained discreet vials of castor beans, oleander leaves, and extracts of poisonous mushrooms gathered from the rare damp shadows of Culiacan. Her mortar and pestle, which for decades had ground spices for her famous moles, now crushed poisons with the same rhythmic cadence. She spent her nights poring over old botany books and toxicology articles she read on the public library's computer, learning about alkaloids and glycosides with the same dedication she once applied to learning how to make the perfect bread. Every sound in her kitchen took on a new meaning. A bubbling pot was no longer a stew, but a deadly decoction. Her first target was Rico, one of the men she overheard at the market. Lupita dedicated a week to becoming his invisible shadow. She watched him from a distance, her presence so natural in the neighborhood landscape that no one noticed her. She learned his lazy routine, his greed, and most importantly, his weakness. The carnitas tacos from a street stall he frequented almost daily. With a particular obsession, she noted that he always asked for an extra serving of salsa verde, consuming it with a voracious appetite. It was a small detail, insignificant to anyone else, but for Lupita, it was the key to the lock, the gateway for her meticulously planned revenge. His routine was her weapon. The execution was a masterpiece of simplicity and deception. The next morning, Lupita prepared a batch of her acclaimed salsa verde, but with a secret ingredient, a concentrated dose of oleander, an ornamental plant that grew abundantly in her own backyard. The slow-acting poison would mimic the symptoms of a massive heart attack. With a gentle smile, she offered a jar of the salsa to the stall owner, an old acquaintance, saying it was a new recipe that needed feedback. The man, honored, gladly accepted the gift. Hours later, Rico devoured his tacos, dousing them generously with the poison sauce, unaware he was consuming his own death sentence, served by the hands of a grandmother. The news arrived the next day, spreading through the neighborhood like a whisper. Rico had been found dead in his apartment. The official cause, as determined by the paramedics, was a heart attack. No one questioned it. His dissolute lifestyle made the diagnosis perfectly plausible. Lupita heard the comments while serving lunch to the children at school, her hands steady, her face a mask of serene neutrality. Inside, however, she felt a wave of cold, grim satisfaction. It was the first name crossed off her mental list, the first piece of her private puzzle of justice falling into place. The feeling was not joy, but one of duty fulfilled, a step taken down a dark, irreversible path. In the solitude of her room that night, the magnitude of her act hit her. The satisfaction gave way to a crushing weight. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had cradled Javier as a baby, that had prepared his favorite meals, and saw them as instruments of death. For the first time, the moral conflict presented itself in its rawest form. She was not a soldier or a vigilante, she was a murderer. In front of a small photo of her grandson on the nightstand, she whispered a plea for forgiveness, not for having killed, but for having become what she needed to be to avenge him. She reaffirmed her vow, accepting that her soul was a fair price to pay for Javier's honored memory. The next target was El Chato, the second man from the market. He was more cautious, rarely eating street food. However, Lupita discovered his passion for agua fresca, de horchata, a drink he consumed in large quantities to combat the Sinaloan heat. Through neighborhood gossip, she also learned of his pre-existing kidney condition. This information was the missing piece. Her nightly research led her to a subtle and terribly effective poison for someone in his condition: ricin, extracted from castor beans. In low doses, it would cause acute, irreversible kidney failure, a tragic but medically plausible diagnosis. Lupita's new recipe was nearly ready. The perfect opportunity arose during a community block party, an event El Chato would never miss. Lupita, as always, contributed her cooking, preparing a huge jug of horchata, praised by all as the best in the area. Dissolved within the sweet, milky drink was the lethal dose of ricin, invisible, tasteless. She watched from a distance as El Chato filled his cup several times, laughing and enjoying himself, completely oblivious to the poison sealing his fate. Lupita served portions to the children, her smile never wavering, her duality a flawless performance of normalcy in the midst of a calculated act of violence. She was life and death, care and poison. 2 days later, El Chato died in a hospital, his kidneys failing with a speed that baffled the doctors. 2 deaths of members of the same faction in less than a month, both attributed to natural causes, were seen as an unfortunate coincidence by most. For the leader, El Sombra, however, the pattern began to look suspicious. Paranoia, trait inherent to his position, began to set in. He didn't see the hand of a vengeful grandmother, but that of a rival cartel, moving silently to weaken his territory. Distrust began to spread within the organization, a slower but equally effective poison. Father Mateo, during his visits, noticed the change in Lupita. The sadness in her eyes had been replaced by a hardness that unsettled him. "Grief can lead us to dark places, Guadalupe," he told her gently one day. "Don't let hatred become the tomb of your own soul. Forgiveness is the path to peace." Lupita merely nodded, her hands busy kneading dough. The priest's words were like echoes from a past life, from a conscience she was systematically silencing. She knew he was right, but peace was no longer her goal. Justice in its most primitive form was. She began to avoid the church, as she could no longer bear the hypocrisy of praying. Her operation became a precise ritual. In an old cookbook, she carved out a secret compartment. There, she kept a small notebook with the 15 names. Next to each one, she jotted down their weaknesses, their habits, and the recipe designated for their demise. It was her war journal, a testament to her transformation. Vengeance ceased to be an act of passion and became a project, executed with the coldness of a chemist and the patience of a cook. She moved through Culiacan like an invisible angel of death, and the smell of her stews now carried an omen of mortality. The deaths continued, each one a surgical strike against the body of the organization. One of El Sombra's lieutenants, known for his severe peanut allergy, suffered a fatal anaphylactic shock after eating a delicious mole his wife received as a gift from the kind Doña Lupita. Another, an informant who suffered from hypertension, died of a devastating stroke. His usual food had been secretly seasoned with a plant extract that sent his blood pressure to unsustainable levels. Each death was an isolated event with a plausible medical explanation, creating a tapestry of accidents and fatalities that baffled and terrified the faction. El Sombra's paranoia exploded, transforming into a violent psychosis. Convinced that a traitor was eliminating his men, he turned his fury inward. The rules became stricter, the punishments for minor mistakes brutal. Fear replaced loyalty. The members of Los Espectros began to eye each other with suspicion, each wondering who would be next to die, whether at the hands of the invisible enemy or their own boss. Lupita, from her kitchen, watched the organization cannibalize itself, rotting from the inside out, just as she had planned. One afternoon, her neighbor Elena rushed to her house, her young son crying. The boy had fallen and scraped his knee. Lupita, with the same natural ease as always, cleaned the wound, applied an herbal salve, and soothed him with a story and a cookie. The act of caring, of healing such a simple pain, was a stab to her. art. That gesture of tenderness was a painful reminder of the woman she used to be, of the simplicity of a life dedicated to nurturing and protecting. For a moment, she felt like a monstrous fraud, using the same facade of a caregiver to hide the darkness she carried. With nearly half the list crossed off, Lupita confronted herself in the mirror. The lines on her face seemed deeper, not from age, but from the weight of her secrets. The initial satisfaction had dissipated, leaving a hollow emptiness. Was this justice, or just a bottomless abyss of violence? The loneliness of her mission was overwhelming. Every name she crossed out of her notebook seemed to erase a piece of her own identity as well. It was in one of these moments of reflection that the thought came like an outcry. If you've ever felt so alone in your fight that you've become unrecognizable to yourself, understand that this pain is the true cost of battle. Knowing my story is being heard through every subscription to this channel gives me the strength not to lose myself completely in this darkness. El Sombra's hunt for the rat reached a new level of brutality. In a fit of paranoia, he publicly executed one of his oldest men based on a flimsy suspicion. The act was designed to instill fear, but only sowed more chaos and resentment. His subordinates, now terrified of his erratic behavior, became sloppy, more focused on surviving their boss's wrath than maintaining control of the territory. Fear, the weapon El Sombra had always used to rule, was now being turned against him, and the empire he built began to crumble under the weight of his own tyranny. Lupita knew that to finish her work, she needed to reach the center of power. El Sombra, however, he had become a human fortress. Distrustful of everyone and everything, he only consumed food prepared by himself or his elderly mother. Poisoning him directly through food was out of the question. She would need a new strategy, an indirect approach that exploited the weaknesses not of him, but of those in his innermost circle. The hunt had become more complex, demanding an even greater level of patience and cunning. She needed to find a new way in. Her focus shifted to El Musculo, El Sombra's personal bodyguard and right-hand man, a loyal, brutal, and nearly incorruptible man, except for one vice, a specific brand of expensive tequila he drank religiously every night before bed. If Lupita couldn't poison the food, she would poison the drink. The plan was risky, as the bottle was kept inside El Sombra's fortified house, a practically impenetrable place. But for Lupita, the impossible had become just another culinary challenge, a recipe that required the right ingredients of opportunity and courage. For weeks, Lupita watched El Sombra's house, studying the comings and goings, searching for any breach in security. The opportunity came in the most unlikely form. The young cleaning lady, Marisol, a girl from the neighborhood, whom Lupita had known since she was a frightened child. Marisol was exploited and mistreated by the faction, working for a pittance and living in constant fear. Lupita saw in her not an accomplice, but a victim, and realized that the key to bringing down the monster was the trembling hand of the one he oppressed. The plan began to take its final shape. Using her reputation as a grandmotherly advisor, Lupita approached Marisol. She didn't use threats, but compassion. She listened to the young woman's complaints about El Musculo's abusive behavior and offered a solution, a small vial containing a colorless, odorless liquid which she described as a potent sleeping aid. She instructed Marisol to put a few drops in the bodyguard's tequila bottle, promising it would only make him sleep soundly, making him less aggressive. The liquid, in fact, was a slow-acting, undetectable poison that would attack the central nervous system over several days. Desperate, Marisol agreed. The plan, however, hit an unforeseen snag. El Sombra's paranoia had reached its peak. Although the search of Marisol on her way out revealed nothing, he decided, on a whim, to install a hidden security camera in his own kitchen. That night, reviewing the footage, he saw the grainy image of the young cleaning lady tampering with his right-hand man's tequila bottle. The betrayal was there, clear and undeniable, But the true identity of his enemy was still a mystery that left him perplexed and enraged. The next morning, El Sombra's men snatched Marisol from her home. Under torture, the terrified young woman confessed everything, revealing the source of the liquid, the kind and harmless Doña Lupita. For El Sombra, the revelation was so absurd it seemed like a delusion. A 70-year-old school cook? The idea was ridiculous. But as he connected the dots, the natural deaths, the food ever present in the community, the coincidence of his men falling ill, the monstrous truth began to take shape. He had been dismantled not by a rival cartel, but by a grandmother with a broken heart and a deadly knowledge of botany. Lupita knew the game had changed when Marisol didn't return home. Elena's worried whispers confirmed her worst fears. Shortly after, she saw a car with tinted windows, a model known to belong to the faction, parked at the end of her street. They were watching her. The invisibility that had been her greatest asset had vanished. The hunter, who for months had moved in the shadows, was now in the sights of her final prey. The silent war was about to become an open and deadly confrontation. Running was not an option. It would be an admission of guilt and would endanger the people she cared about, like Elena and her son. So, Lupita continued her routine with a supernatural calm. She went to school, served lunch with a smile, greeted her neighbors, and returned home, all under the watchful eyes of El Sombra's lookouts. Her home was no longer a refuge, it was bait. And her kitchen, once a laboratory, was now being prepared to become a battlefield, where the final supper of her revenge would be served. El Sombra did not act immediately. Pride and disbelief held him back. He needed to confront her, to look into the eyes of the woman who had humiliated him and destroyed his empire with seasonings and herbs. He wanted to savor his final victory, to understand the mind behind the plan before extinguishing her life. This arrogance, this need for a dramatic confrontation, was his fatal mistake. It gave Lupita the most precious commodity she could have at that moment, time to prepare the final trap, not with poisons, but with the tools of her trade. She knew he wouldn't confront her at her home, as that would draw too much attention. He would choose a place that was symbolic, a place that represented her domain, the school kitchen. Deserted at night, it was the perfect stage for the final act. That night, Lupita didn't work with extracts or powders. She worked with pressure cookers, gallons of cooking oil, and the geography of the environment she knew like the back of her hand. She was transforming the place that symbolized innocence and life into a deadly trap, ready to receive her last guest. The school kitchen was plunged into a dense, abnormal silence. The laughter of children and the clatter of pans were replaced by the stillness of the night, broken only by the constant hum of the industrial refrigerators. Lupita waited in the shadows, hidden among the stainless steel giants. She was no longer the frail cook. She was a hunter in her own territory, every nerve in her body alert and vibrating with a mix of fear and determination. The air was heavy, charged with the electricity that precedes a storm. She had set the stage for the final act, and every object, every pot and every utensil had a role to play in the deadly piece she was about to perform. She was ready. El Sombra did not arrive with an army. His arrogance demanded an intimate audience for what he imagined would be the final humiliation of his enemy. He entered the kitchen, flanked by only two of his most loyal men, their boots echoing on the tiled floor. He found her standing by a stove, the small, stooped figure looking pathetically out of place in the vast darkness of the kitchen. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Abuela!" he scoffed, the word dripping with contempt. "Did you really think you could bring down my empire with soups and spices? I've come to give you your last cooking lesson." To his surprise, Lupita neither trembled nor begged. She faced him with an impassive dignity that disarmed him for a second. In her eyes, he did not see the fear of a victim, but the cold contempt of a judge. Breaking the silence, she uttered a single word, her tone firm and clear. "Javier." Her grandson's name hung in the air between them. An accusation, a summoned ghost. That simple act of defiance broke El Sombra's composure. Rage replaced amusement. "Get her," he growled at his men. "Let's see if your dead grandson's name will save you now." The instant they moved forward, the kitchen transformed. With a swift, rehearsed motion, Lupita opened the valve of an industrial stockpot that was simmering quietly on the stove. A violent jet of scalding water erupted toward the two henchmen. Their screams of agony echoed through the space as the boiling water hit their faces and chests, blinding them and forcing them to recoil in panic. At the same time, with a precise kick, she knocked over a large container of cooking oil she had strategically placed. The thick, golden liquid spread across the floor, turning the polished tile into a treacherous, slippery trap. The battlefield was set, and the rules were hers. El Sombra, caught off guard by the sudden eruption of violence, slipped on the oil as he tried to advance, his imposing posture undone in a humiliating loss of balance. Lupita, on the other hand, moved with surprising agility, her rubber-soled shoes, chosen for the occasion, giving her a secure grip on the dangerous floor. She dodged behind a metal counter, the environment she knew so intimately now serving as her shield and her weapon. It was not a fight of brute strength, but a deadly ballet of intelligence and knowledge of the terrain. The kitchen, the place where she nurtured life, had become the labyrinth where death hunted its final prey. Enraged and disoriented, El Sombra managed to get to his feet, pulling a knife from his waistband. The blade glinted under the emergency light. He cursed at her, his fury making his movements wild and predictable as he closed in. It was in this moment of final decision, the climax of her dark journey, that a clear thought crossed her mind. In this moment there was nothing left in me but the love for my grandson. If having to become a monster to hunt the monsters who took him was the price, I paid it. I ask you to subscribe and share so the world knows that even the gentlest love can become the deadliest of weapons when everything else is taken from you. When he lunged at her, Lupita didn't retreat. She moved sideways, and the knife sliced through empty air. From the wall of utensils, she grabbed her chosen weapon. It was not a knife or a cleaver, but her most faithful and ancient work companion, a heavy, solid wood rolling pin. As El Sombra turned, surprise on his face, she raised it. With a guttural cry, an explosion of all the pain, rage, and grief she had suppressed for a year, she struck him on the side of the head. The impact made a sickening, hollow sound. He staggered, the look of disbelief turning to a shocked emptiness. She struck him again with all the force of her being. He fell to the floor and did not move. Silence returned, absolute and final. In the stillness of the devastated kitchen, amidst the smell of oil and death, Lupita stood motionless for a long moment. The echo of the final blow still vibrated. In her bones, the end of her hunt brought no euphoria or relief, only a deep, resonant emptiness. With the same methodical precision with which she had planned each death, she began to clean. She moved with the efficiency of a professional, erasing her tracks, straightening what she could, turning the scene of a brutal confrontation into something resembling a robbery gone wrong. Before dawn, she slipped out of the school and disappeared into the sleeping streets of Culiacan, leaving the bodies behind for the world to create its own lie. The official story would be the expected one, an internal settling of scores, the faction imploding under the weight of its own violence. In the weeks that followed, a subtle but profound change swept through the neighborhood. With El Sombra and his inner circle eliminated, the power of Los Espectros fragmented and evaporated. The young men who once stood on corners with threatening gazes disappeared. Music started playing later into the night in homes again, and children played in the street with a freedom they hadn't known in years. A sense of peace, fragile and uncertain, began to take root. Lupita watched this transformation from her kitchen window, an invisible architect of her community's new tranquility. She had given them the security the system had denied them, but the price of that peace was her complete and irrevocable isolation. Lupita's revenge was complete. The 15 men who took her grandson's life and laughed at her pain were dead. The stain on Javier's name had been cleansed with blood. However, the victory tasted of bitter ashes. The peace she had won for others found no home in her own soul. The act of cooking, which had once been her greatest joy and expression of love, became a constant reminder of how she had perverted her gift, turning it into a weapon. The faith she once had in justice and human goodness was the final victim of her war, a silent sacrifice she made so that her grandson's memory could rest. She was free, but not at peace. Months passed, and routine re-established itself with its relentless force. Doña Lupita continued to be the school cook. Every day she served hot meals to the children, her face adorned with the same gentle smile everyone knew. On an ordinary afternoon, a little girl with pigtails, upon receiving her plate, looked up and said with childlike sincerity, "Thank you, Doña Lupita. Nobody cooks like you." Lupita caressed the child's face, and for a brief instant, a genuine warmth filled her chest. But it was only a moment. Her eyes, for anyone who dared to look closely, no longer reflected the light. They held the darkness of an abyss and the unfathomable weight of 15 secrets she would carry to her grave. Justice in the end was a matter of perspective. There was no redemption, only a conclusion. Lupita became the silent guardian of her neighborhood, a living paradox of creation and destruction. She continues to feed the children and grandchildren of her neighbors, a daily act of penance and a constant reminder of the innocent world she fought to protect, even if it meant destroying herself to do so. My journey ends here, where it all began, in the kitchen. I thank each of you for listening to my story to the end, for witnessing my pain and my fury. If my account meant something, I ask you to subscribe. By doing so, you not only support the channel, but you ensure that voices like mine, the voices of those who were forced to find justice in the shadows, are never lost in the silence.